Okay, so we move to our final speaker, who's going to continue giving us some perspectives on state of the art and beyond in greenhouse horticulture and vertical farming. So, Heuvelink, please.
Well, thank you, Graham, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk, the last talk of the day at this special event, 100 years of the Journal of Horticultural Science and Biotechnology. When I started as a horticultural researcher, and you can see from my gray here, that's quite some years ago, there were not so many journals around, not like today. And as a horticultural scientist, in fact, the Journal of Horticultural Science and perhaps Scientia Horticulturae and perhaps one or two American journals, that was about it, where you could publish decent research, which was not also having a lot of deep physiology and molecular science and so on. And I think that is still necessary to have such a journal. And so I expect that this 100 years is a great celebration, but I'm looking forward that it will go on for many more years, also for my young colleagues, that they have the possibility to publish good work on the crop physiology, which not necessarily has also gene expression data, because that's what nowadays physiological journals always will ask for. Well, it's a pleasure that I can present here some work of Wageningen, and we heard already something about vertical farming, the pros and cons perhaps, and is it really going to be something? Well, after my talk, I'm open to any more questions about that. I think myself, it has value, there are niches, but certainly people who tell you that vertical farming will be the future system of world food production, forget it. I start with history. Here you see a slide from a colleague, Cecilia Stangelini, showing data of Dutch greenhouse vegetable production, tomatoes, cucumber, sweet pepper, over the period of about 30-35 years. And you see for all three crops, substantial increase in yield. For tomato in the early 80s, you did a good job as a grower if you had 30 kilograms per square meter per year. Well, now it's over 60, the best growers, and depending a bit on the cultivar, you can come above 70 kilograms per square meter per year without the use of supplementary light. What I also write here, which is important, is the input of energy. Probably most of you will know that in Dutch greenhouses, we need natural gas for heating our greenhouses. In the early 80s, it was very normal to have 55 cubic meter of natural gas per year per square meter for heating your greenhouse. Now it's more like 30 cubic meters, so that brings together with the yield increase that the gas use efficiency has been improved by a factor 4 over this period. So doubling the yield with about half of the natural gas used. Well, what are reasons for this increase in yield? Of course, like with many things, there are several reasons. Improvement in greenhouse technology. For example, the modern greenhouses have a much higher light transmissivity than the old greenhouses. The most modern ones, you see one photograph here. Well, if they are just built, you can obtain a light transmissivity of 80%. So only 20% is lost by the construction and by the glass. In an older greenhouse, well, you do already a good job if you have 65% of the light from outside inside your greenhouse. Cultivation techniques, growing out of soil, so better control over the root environment, which will hopefully lead to a more optimal root environment and therefore higher yields possible. The high wire system, which makes that we don't have a break in summer anymore, where you remove the spring crop and you plant an autumn crop. No, you go on with the same plants from December till November next year, and starting in March with production until November, every week there is production. And the use of rootstocks have also contributed to making that possible, that plants can last so long and also can perform well in summer, where it is, well, the stems are already very long, where the temperature is perhaps on the too high side, even in the Netherlands in the greenhouse. But rootstocks help with that, maintaining the crop throughout the whole season. Greenhouse climate control. Well, nowadays it's all computers are used for climate control. That gives at least more flexibility, and CO2 enrichment has become very common. That's also typically something which may increase yield by about 15%, depending on the situation. And supplementary light also mentioned here in one of my following slides, I will say more about that, but in a country like the Netherlands, but also the UK, if you want to produce year-round tomatoes, so also picking tomatoes with Christmas, yeah, the only option is to have supplementary light because our winter period has too low light intensities, too short days. You can grow tomato plants then, but you cannot produce fruits at that time. You can grow the young plants. And the last one, and there I will go a little bit deeper, and I'm happy that I selected that because that fits quite well with what Jim was talking about. Of course, breeding will also have contributed to the higher yield. At least that's what we all, and especially the breeders, will hope. So before I dive into some of the experiments, I will show you the yield component analysis which we applied, because I wanted not only to know, well, modern cultivars probably have a higher yield when you grow them under the same conditions as old cultivars. That's quite likely, but yeah, the next step is then, and why is that? Well, here you see a component analysis. If the fresh yield of modern tomato cultivars is higher, in principle, you have two options. It can be just a dilution with water. So the dry matter in the tomato fruits is diluted more with water, and therefore you get more fresh weight. But of course, you will all agree with me that probably that will not be the best option when you're also thinking of a good taste. So let's hope that that is not the only reason for a higher yield in modern cultivars. And the other option is that the dry matter in the fruits, so all fruits together over the whole year, the dry matter there is higher in the modern cultivar than in the old cultivar. Well, then you can dive deeper. If the dry matter in the fruits is higher, in principle, two options. Total plant biomass production is higher for modern cultivars, or it is a matter of harvest index. From the same biomass in total produced, a larger fraction goes into the fruits. Well, actually, when I started this research, I was thinking based on the work which was done with weeds, or arable crop, cereal, that the fraction to the fruits certainly would be an explanatory factor, because for that crop, the short straw was, with the modern cultivars, the main reason for having higher yields, because that resulted in a higher fraction to the seeds. Well, we can dive deeper. I won't go at all the details here, but if the total biomass production is higher, it could mean a higher light use efficiency because of higher leaf photosynthesis rate, under the same conditions, a higher leaf photosynthesis, or a lower light extinction coefficient. That's something I need to explain. If the modern crop would have an architecture which makes that the light penetrates deeper in the canopy, so less absorption by the top leaves, which are closer to light saturation, and more light deeper in the canopy, where the leaves are more in the shade, and they are more in the linear part of the photosynthesis curve, they can do more with this extra light, well, then the total canopy photosynthesis would be higher. So a modern cultivar, if that would have a lower extinction coefficient, deeper penetration of the light, that would be favorable for the yield. Well, let's look at the experiments. Here I show one of the two experiments already from quite some years ago, as you can see. And a short cultivation in autumn with 8 cultivars with different years of introduction. The oldest one, known to some of you, I think, Moneymaker, was introduced in 1950. It's still used a lot in genetic and physiological studies, but for a tomato grower, it would certainly be a money loser because it has a very low yield compared to modern hybrid cultivars. And here we see for this experiment the yield against the year of release of that cultivar. And fortunately, we found a significant increase in yield with a later year of introduction of the cultivar. So that fits with what we were hoping for already. I show you this graph, but in fact, the two experiments where I did the whole study on, they are shown here. So the 2007 one and the 2014 experiment. But I cannot show, or I don't show the yields here, but I show relative yield. And I had to do that because the two experiments didn't have the same length. And then automatically cultivars which were in the second experiment, yeah, automatically they get a higher yield because they are grown for a longer period. So in both experiments, there were 3 cultivars the same. And I take those as a reference to scale the two experiments so that I could still use the data from all experiments, all 2 experiments in this analysis. So therefore, relative yield and also these underlying components, they were all made relative by scaling to the 3 cultivars which were common in both data sets. And from this we can read that with every later year of introduction, based on these cultivars, a 0.7% yield increase was realized every year. And back to the scheme, what was then the underlying cause of this yield increase? Not the harvest index, not the fraction to the fruits, much to my surprise, but it was the higher light use efficiency because of higher photosynthesis rates, quite unexpectedly, and a lower extinction coefficient. So indeed, the modern cultivars have an architecture, leaf angles, which makes that the light penetrates deeper in the canopy. Therefore, more total biomass production, therefore also higher dry matter in the fruits. There was also an effect of the fruit dry matter content. So that's not necessarily nice. The modern cultivars have a lower fruit dry matter content. If I tell this to breeders, they will tell me correctly, yeah, but it's not, taste is not only about the fruit dry matter content, it's also about what is this dry matter, so the composition of the dry matter. So we cannot directly say that this leads to less tasting tomatoes, but going in the direction of lower dry matter content is anyway not something I would strongly advise if you want to go for higher yields. And then back to where I started, this doubling in yield. From this we can deduce that over the past 30 years, this twice as high tomato yield, about 20–25% of that yield increase comes from improved cultivars. I mentioned already that we need supplementary light if we want to grow tomatoes in our country in the winter season. And here an experiment with tomato and cucumber, where the supplementary light was not only added at the top. Normally you would think if you use lamps, well, you put them on top because that's also where the sunlight comes from. And with the more traditional high pressure sodium lamps, that's the only option you have because they get very hot. They have high radiative heat. But if you work with LED lights, which is much more common nowadays, LED lights you can also put inside your crop, so in between the plants. And that could have certain advantages because the top leaves, they are already closer to light saturation because they have also the light from the sun. So if you give the extra light, at least partly, not to the top leaves, but to the leaves deeper in the canopy, that might result in higher yields. So we compared LED light as additional light only at the top, 100% top light, or 2/3 from the top and 1/3 as intercanopy lighting. And we did it as 2 intensities, 250 micromole as total light intensity and 375. Well, that 375 nowadays might sound crazily high. At the time we did the experiment, we selected it on purpose because we saw every year growers are investing in higher intensities of supplementary light. So if we want to be relevant, also 5 years from now, better do also a treatment with a very high light intensity. But of course, with the very high electricity prices from last year, now the story is more that growers want to use their lights as less as possible. So completely different, and certainly not the aim is anymore to have higher and higher intensities installed in your greenhouse. But anyway, what we got as results here first for cucumber is fitting with our expectation. If you give part of the light as intercanopy light, so to the lower leaves in the crop, you indeed obtain a higher yield compared to giving all the supplementary light as top light. And that effect is even bigger if the total amount of supplementary light is higher, so the 375 micromole compared to the 250. Well, and similar results were obtained for tomato, of course, not exactly the same percentages, but the story remains the same. I'm not saying now to a grower that you should invest in supplementary light, because from the plant point of view, from the production point of view, certainly this is an advantage, but there are additional things to consider. In the end, it's an economic decision. And each micromole you give as supplementary light, a micromole as intercanopy light is, they tell me at least, is more expensive than a micromole from the top. With this intercanopy light, the modules get more dirty. You can get pests hiding in these modules. It's difficult to clean when you go from one crop to the next season to another crop. So these are all kind of things to consider in the end. in your decision. But if the question is about what does it mean for yield, then intercanopy light, part of the light as intercanopy light, is an advantage. So the one reason of this, why it was higher, but I mentioned that also already in words. The light is given to the leaves lower in the canopy, so they can do more with the light. But we see also here, if you make a light response curve from these top leaves, or from leaves lower in the canopy, where there was yes or no intercanopy lighting, these top leaves, of these intercanopy leaves, they have also a higher response curve. So that means that they stay more active. They adapt less to the shade if there is this intercanopy light. So that means that they can also do more with the sunlight, which reaches at this lower level. Well, then another possibility to improve yields, and this was done in a vertical farming setting, but the whole story is equally valid for the greenhouse. If we start with a crop, often a lot of the light is not used by the crop. It's just falling next to the plants, and only the light which is absorbed by green leaves will contribute to the production. So here one of our PhD students, Margarethe, she did a study with dwarf tomatoes that fits in a vertical farm, and she compared a high density all the time, 100 plants per square meter, or a low density, 18 plants per square meter, and that low density may sound very low, but that was the density which was advised by the breeding company who made this dwarf tomato cultivar. So in that sense, the normal density. And two treatments where she started with a very high density and then gradually spaced the plants. And that gradually happened when 75% of the area was covered with leaves, if you look from the top with a camera, or when 90% was ground coverage was reached. Then a spacing step was done, and we see here with the scheme the different spacing steps. On average, that resulted in 41 plants per square meter or 54 plants per square meter. Well, these treatments were done because you could think already, well, why not keep the high density all the time? Because then from the beginning, you intercept a lot of light, and in general, you would expect high density, more plants per square meter, that will be the highest yield. But the downside is that often is not the best quality if you have such a very high density. And she tried here with this dynamic spacing to have on the one hand a high yield, but also maintain a good quality of the fruits. So what happens with yield is what we would expect based on the planting density. High density, a much higher yield than the low density. And this spacing at 75% ground coverage, well, that more than doubled the yield already. And for 90%, it's even a bit more than this low density treatment. So the yield, no surprises. But with the quality, and only two quality aspects here, the titratable acid and the total soluble solids, but they are used often as important characteristics for the taste of the tomato fruits. At the high density, that was clearly significantly reduced, both of them, compared to the low density. But if you see this dynamic spacing, then there was hardly a reduction or not at all for the dynamic spacing compared to the low density. So this shows that you can maintain the quality and more than double the yield if you do a dynamic spacing. I mentioned already the high electricity prices. Now from our growers, we get a lot of questions about, can I give more light to the plants when electricity is cheap? Because during the 24-hour cycle, well, if we all come home from our work, then electricity is very expensive because everybody is using electricity. But after midnight, there are quite some hours where electricity is very cheap, at least in our country, and I think that's in many places, because then people hardly use electricity. And that effect will become even bigger with more moving towards wind energy and solar energy, that effect of differences in prices. Because when there is a lot of availability, well, there will be a low price of this electricity. Can we make use of that? Because then growers could give a lot of light when electricity is cheap and less light when electricity is expensive. If you can then obtain the same growth and yield, well, you do that at a much lower cost. So that sounds very attractive, but in fact, that involves then that you must know something about, can we use the plant as an as a battery here, it is said very popular speaking, so as a storage, and that can be via starch, which is stored in plants. And this is not that new, perhaps for light it is, but for temperature, this is done already for many years, heating the greenhouse more when it is cheap. For example, in March, it's heated up by the sun in the middle of the day, and you keep your windows somewhat longer closed. You get a higher temperature than what you really want, but you compensate that with less heating in the night. So you save energy and you have the same 24-hour average temperature. Well, Cristina Cepeda, one of the PhD students, she did a study with young tomato plants to compare two very extreme treatments. What she did here was one day with high light together with high temperature. Next day, low light with low temperature, and so on for 20 days. That's in phase because the high light goes together with the high temperature. And the other extreme, that was anti-phase, and where the periods were not one day this, one day that, but 10 days this, 10 days that. And anti-phase, so there were 10 days with low light, high temperature, followed by 10 days with high light, low temperature. Well, what does this mean? Much to our surprise, the total dry matter production of these tomato plants was exactly the same. But there was a difference if you have the 2 days phase treatment, then most of this dry matter was indeed structural dry matter, and a small part was non-structural, so sugars and starch. Whereas for the treatment here, the anti-phase 20 days, it was the opposite, less structural dry matter and more non-structural dry matter. Well, that it worked out like that is, if you look at the treatments, quite logic, because at the end of this treatment, so the last 10 days, there was high light with low temperature. So that is typically the conditions where you expect a lot of photosynthesis can be going on because there's a high availability of light, but a low temperature, so not much demand for assimilates from the sink organs, so you automatically get storage. But the idea is that if you would follow this, that these non-structural carbohydrates, they can still be built in. They are available for growth of the plants. So this would show there is a lot of flexibility. I think in general, more research in this field of using the plant as a battery is needed to make the maximum out of it, using this as a way to grow either more produce or to grow our produce in a smarter way, in a more resource use efficient way. Well, then I have some stories about far-red light. I still have some time here. 5-7 minutes. Then I should hurry up then. About far-red light. So that's the wavelengths which are just above the visible, so between 700 and 750 nanometers. And for a long time, that was more or less forgotten because the idea was it has no effect on photosynthesis, so why bother? It's also typically in a vertical farm, there's usually far-red light is not used, there's red-blue usually, and also in supplementary light in the greenhouse, typically with LEDs, it's often a lot of red because that's cheapest, the highest amount of micromoles out of a joule of electricity, and a little bit of blue because we found out that only red that is not optimal. But by now we know that far-red light plays a role in photosynthesis together with the other wavelengths, and also that it increases yield if you add far-red light. And that's shown here for an experiment with the old cultivar moneymaker. And no 30 or 50 micromoles of far-red added to the spectrum of 150 micromole red and blue, significant increase in fruit dry matter for this additional far-red. And this was in the greenhouse. But yeah, in the winter in the Netherlands with rather small compartments, so only 12% of the light received by the plants was solar light and 88% came from the supplementary light. Well, what does this mean for the light use efficiency? If you add far-red light, the light use efficiency, the grams of dry matter of fruits produced per mole of light significantly increased with this additional far-red. However, that might be not totally fair because you add photons if you add far-red light. So if you calculate what we call the radiation use efficiency, so that's the grams of dry matter, not per mole of photosynthetic active radiation, but per mole of photons in total, so including the far-red, well, then no change, so hardly any change in the radiation use efficiency. Well, that would mean that this far red light is as efficient as the addition of red and blue light. Otherwise, the radiation use efficiency would not stay the same. Well, why does the far red result in a higher fruit dry mass? Again, this yield component analysis. Jongran, a postdoc now in our group, but at that time a PhD student, he showed that this effect of far red light on the improvement of tomato yield was almost completely caused by an effect on partitioning. The fraction to the fruits was substantially higher if you have far red light in your spectrum. And we also wanted to know whether we can quantitatively explain how that works, because now I know, okay, the partitioning is influenced, but why is then the partitioning influenced, this fraction to the fruits? And for that, I have to introduce to you the potential growth rate. We take that as a measure for the demand for assimilase from a fruit. And what we see here is the control treatment with red blue light. If I have 1 fruit per truss or if I have 2 fruits per truss, I get exactly the same final fruit weight grown in exactly the same time. So that reflects to me the demand for assimilase from the fruit, because if there would be source limitation here, then I expect, if I compare 2 fruits per truss with 1 fruit per truss, that this 1 fruit per truss can grow bigger if it was competing with the other fruit, but apparently not. So these are grown on a non-assimilate limiting, in a non-assimilate limiting situation. Well, the interesting thing is what happened with the far red treatment. The same, also 1 or 2 fruits per truss showed exactly the same growth, but a much higher growth than the control treatment with only red and blue. About 40% higher fruit size, potential fruit size, if you have far red. So that is translated then as a 40% higher sink strength of the fruits. Now, can that explain the whole observation about improved partitioning, also quantitatively? For that, I use a model. I don't go in the details of the model, but the core function here is that the fraction to the fruits is defined as the sink strength of the fruits divided by the sink strength of all organs on the plant, so the fruits and the vegetative parts. So that seems very straightforward. Well, what we did, we looked at this experiment which I earlier showed, where far red improved the partitioning to the fruits from 32.9 to 40.4%. I tuned the Thompson model to the control situation. Tuning means that initiation rate of trusses was adapted to the cultivar where this experiment was about, so the money maker, and the total fruit growth period was adapted so that for the control situation, the model would predict exactly what we found in the partitioning. But then the exciting thing is, if I now in this model make only 1 change, if I make the fruit sink strength 40% bigger. That's what I found in one of the previous slides. Only the sink strength of an individual fruit is 40% larger. What happens then with the partitioning? Well, and luckily, we get almost equal partitioning results at what was observed in this greenhouse experiment. By the way, the sink strength data come from a climate room experiment, so that was independent from this greenhouse experiment. So this is a very strong proof that indeed also quantitatively, the improved fruit sink strength caused by far red explains the improved partitioning to the fruits, the improved harvest index. How much time do I have? Otherwise, I will skip a few slides, but I can decide then a couple.
How many slides?
I think not so many anymore, but probably I skipped then this one. I will do one about the ornamentals, because that's otherwise we may think that he works only on tomatoes and cucumbers. But talking about far red light, we also have some work on chrysanthemum from Sharat. It's already known for quite a while that if you grow chrysanthemum, a short day plant, in a climate room with 11 hours of mixture of red and blue, followed by 4 hours of blue, so in total 15 hours of light, so that's a long day, it can normally flower just like when you would give it only the short day of 11 hours. Well, that's very exciting. Sharad also found that that holds for other short-day plants like Artemisia, Cosmos, Poinsettia, but not in general. There are also short-day plants like Calendulae, Perilla, Stevia, where you cannot do this trick. If you give them this treatment, they will really see it as a long day and they will not flower. Well, why would you want this to give extra light? Because chrysanthemum growers have supplementary light now normally in the greenhouse, and they can only use it for 11 or a little bit more hours because otherwise they don't get flowers. So they need to give short days. And they want to use it more hours because then you produce more biomass, or you can have a higher planting density. And that's also in the end giving more chrysanthemum stems with flowers per square meter. So there is an interest in growing at more hours of light. But we tried, of course, this in the greenhouse and it didn't work. So why does it not work in the greenhouse? There can be many reasons, but if you look at the greenhouse, then the 11 hours are solar light. So there's not only red and blue, there is all kind of wavelength, but also the far red is in this solar light. And in the experiment I show you, we investigated whether far red in the solar light is indeed the explanation why the trick with 11 hours of in this case from the greenhouse, natural light plus 4 hours of blue will not be seen as a short day, so the chrysanthemum will not flower. Yeah, and that is the result is shown here. The days to visible flower buds. Well, in these two treatments, the short day or the blue extended short day, when the short day is only red and blue, well, that's almost the same, 22, 23 days. But if we have far red in this 11 hours here, then there is no flowering, not even after 35 days. And then I go to my conclusion. Well, one slide more before the conclusion. But the conclusion, actually, there is no conclusion slide, only a photograph. But I'm happy that Simon had already given his talk, so I didn't have to say anything anymore about AI and the use of AI. Anyway, he can do that much better than I can. But I had also in the title future developments. Well, this is one slide about future developments I see happening. In the Netherlands, we have to be, with our greenhouses, carbon neutral. The year that exactly that has to happen is shifting a little bit, but anyway, it has to happen. So there's a lot of focus now on all electric greenhouses, where also the heating is done with electricity and not by natural gas anymore. Well, the labor shortage was already discussed earlier today with robots partly taking over. I see a lot of potential for the combination of sensors and models. Perhaps some of you may know that my background is in crop physiology and modeling. With the combination of sensors and models, I think that can be very powerful. Well, what happens with our growing systems, of course, I cannot predict, but based on what was also said by Simon, I would not be surprised, or it was perhaps in the discussion with him, that this high-wire tomato system, that's not a very convenient system for a robot to harvest in. That's a very complex crop and very heterogeneous. A way of growing with single trusses, and also there I'm not the first one proposing that would, from the point of automation and robotization, be a much more easy way of growing. So that comes in the direction of, well, we can make robots who can try to copy what humans are doing, or we can try to make our growing systems more simple in between brackets so that robots can do the work. And the last slide then is about the Wageningen Autonomous Greenhouse Challenge. I was quite surprised myself. There is already for several years such a challenge that AI-supported teams outperformed human-operated greenhouses. And you might think, yeah, human-operated, but that was the greenhouse, with in this case cherry tomatoes, where the climate control was done by experienced growers. So growers from our area who knew what they were doing, and they were of course also shocked themselves that these people on distance with AI, with computer models, could obtain a higher net profit than what they obtained. So that shows, at least to me, I think the grower will never be fully replaced, but there is potential for AI, and that's also necessary because there is a big shortage in experienced, high-quality growers. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention.